listen to good music and keep rocking.
Down to the crossroads, fell down on my knees. Down to the crossroads, fell down on my knees. Ask the Lord for mercy, save me if you please.
Hey everybody, this is the Reverend Brian Blair, and you are listening to 91.7 FM Stores, WHUS here on the campus of Yukon. And I am here today on the show called Crossroads with my very special guest, Frank. How about, do we want to call you Professor?
Well, you can just call me Frank.
All right, we're going to call you Frank. Mr. Frank Kirkpatrick is here as our special guest today. We're going to get around to what we're talking about specifically in just a minute, but first, just a couple of announcements. We're not taking phone-ins, so if you'd like to communicate, find me at Rev Blair, REVBLAYER on Twitter. A couple of announcements about some good things going on here in the community. There is the Walk for Warmth coming up right after Thanksgiving, right before Thanksgiving. Check it out on the website for WAIM, W-A-I-M, Wyndham Area Interfaith Ministry, and see about participating in the Walk for Warmth. It goes to a great cause. Some people cannot pay for their heat during the winter, and that's no good. So you get out, you walk a little bit, you make some friends, you meet some people. There's an interfaith Thanksgiving service right before we begin walking. So go to the website for WAIM, sign up for the Walk for Warmth, and help make the world a better place by keeping people warm. Great to have everybody on today, and great to be here with our guest, Frank. How are you today, Frank?
I'm doing just fine, thanks, Brian.
Frank, why don't you please, if you don't mind, tell us what you do or have done?
Well, I've recently retired from teaching at Trinity College in Hartford. I was a professor of religious studies with a focus in Christianity and theology and ethics.
That is quite a bit. What did you mainly teach? Like, could you give us a description or a name for one of the classes?
Well, when I was hired, I had to teach the history of Western theology. That took 2 semesters. I had to teach a course on the history of religion in America. And then as a requirement, I had to teach a course called Christian Social Ethics. And I basically did most of my research and my teaching around those topics.
As a requirement, you know, when you say it like that, it's like, so they forced you to be ethical?
Well, they at least forced me to know about ethics, even if I wasn't ethical myself. Well, I hope I didn't violate ethical requirements myself.
Well, so you got out alive, right? So I guess
Got
if you
out
did,
alive.
they didn't catch you.
Exactly.
That's good. Did you enjoy it?
I loved it. I taught for 45 years, and I thought it was absolutely the high point of my life. I occasionally would wake up and say, why are they paying me to do this stuff? I'd
Wow.
do it free if I could.
Fantastic. Now, you recently retired, you said.
Yeah, I retired in 2016, and I tried to keep active intellectually by doing various kinds of projects in my mind, and so I'm still, and I'm teaching occasionally in a program called the Academy of Lifelong Learning, which is run by Trinity College, but is essentially for people from the neighborhood, from the larger community who would like to just keep their minds active.
What kind of things are you teaching there?
Well, the one that I've done most recently was a course on morality, the economy, politics, and government.
All wrapped up in one?
All in one course, exactly.
Well, that's a lot of why I wanted to invite you to come talk to us today. You know, on that one course, that is a lot of what you and I had a conversation about a few weeks back, yes?
Yes, exactly.
And so I'm really glad that you're here today. For our audience, you know, typically this show, it's called Crossroads because I invite people to talk about the intersection of their faith life and their everyday life. You're an exception to that standard for the show because your faith life is your everyday life. But I really wanted to hear your thoughts on what you just listed for that class. So I thought we could have a little bit of fun today, sharing your thoughts about economics, government, morality, how those all make some sort of a soup, whether it's tasty or not.
That's right. That's been, I have to confess that in all the topics that we covered when I was doing Christian social ethics, the one that I felt the most uncertain about, the most intimidated by, was an area called economic ethics. Believe it or not, I had never taken an economics course when I was in college. When I began to look into economics as one of the topics that we took up in the ethics course, I realized I didn't have the mathematical background or the introduction to the esoteric, arcane terminology that's often used by economists, and so I tended to skip lightly over that topic. But I became more and more convinced as time went on that we can't really deal with some of the fundamental moral issues of our society without looking at the economic system within which those problems arise. And so I got an economist friend of mine to give me a starting list of books to read. And then that just expanded and expanded and expanded, and finally after about a year and a half I'd read 75 books on the topic. And while I'm still not able to be in conversation at the micro level with the professional economists, I think I now have come to an understanding of the morality that must be brought into the economic and political arena if we're to make sense of our world and make it a more decent place for people to live in.
Is there somebody you've read that really guides your thinking?
Well, going way back to the beginning, the person who was probably had the deepest influence on me from an ethical point of view was Reinhold Neibuhr, the great moral theologian in the Christian community in the United States. And his book, Moral Man and Immoral Society, is still, I think, one of the most important but underrated books in American history. And it certainly influenced me as I came to look at the fundamental question, which, to put it very simply, is the question of the disproportionate allocation of power in society. People who have a disproportionate amount of power can influence society in ways that really do influence the provision of social justice for people in need.
You bring that up, that idea, the 1%, has been discussed for a number of years now. So do you think that this is a pertinent issue?
I think it's an issue that's becoming more and more to bother people. Whether you're a Christian or not a Christian, whether you're a Jew or a Muslim, or whether you're just operating out of a secular set of values, the value, the priority of fairness is one that I think is part of the American consciousness today. And when you look at the fact that, for example, many CEOs are now paid 250 or 270 times the amount of money that the middle managers under them make. People are asking the question, is that morally just? Is it morally fair? So I think it's something that's beginning to become conscious to many people, but what they don't have is the vocabulary, the equipment, the resources by which they can analyze the fundamental structural problems in society. And that's what I'm really looking at in the personal research that I'm doing.
Well, how could we move to a place where your average citizen is actually capable of analyzing something like that?
Well, I think you have to begin with where you began earlier. You have to say that we're part of a society in which we are all economic actors to some degree or another. Every time I go out and buy food at the grocery store, I'm entering into economic transactions with people. There are rules and regulations about what can and can't be sold at the grocery store. That's politics. Politics is the work of the people trying to decide what rules and policies people should live by in society. And there is morality. Morality helps us to determine what we think is fair and just. And so these three things can't be separated from each other, despite the efforts of some people to say that the market economy, the capitalist society, the free enterprise system doesn't need a morality, it will solve its problems on its own. And I've just come to believe that that's not true.
Well, what makes you think that that's not true?
Because morality, some kind of moral judgment is made all over the place. Let's take the example of health care. Americans have, I think, at some level decided that in some way it is just and fair that all people have access to adequate health care, regardless of their personal ability to pay for it. That's a moral judgment. But putting that moral judgment into practice requires politics. Politics is the policy-making actions of the society as a whole through representative assemblies like the Congress or the state legislature or the municipal boards of education and so forth. And that requires some level of government. Government then must make some intrusion into the economic order. Some things simply can't be put up for sale. I'm sure there's a market for selling children, as disgusting, as morally depraved as that might be, but we don't allow that even in a free market society because we've made a moral judgment that selling children is not morally permissible. So economic transactions, political decisions, governmental interference, and morality are all intertwined with each other and can't be separated.
It's interesting that you use a far-fetched idea of selling children, but drugs are it's a regular conversation more and more these days now that some states have legalized marijuana.
Right.
Right? So, again, back to your point, there are certain things that society, through politics, as you define it, which I'm glad you defined it that way, make decisions about what the market, what is permissible in a free market. And so the free market is never entirely free.
Exactly, and one of my tasks, I think, is to try to explode or deconstruct the notion that the market is without moral values. The market is always hemmed in and constrained to some degree by decisions over moral values that the society has made. And drug use is one of them. I mean, at one time, marijuana was not permitted for moral reasons in any state in the country. Today, that through political processes, through political debate, negotiation, and deliberation, marijuana has now become an acceptable drug that can be obtained under certain conditions. And that's what society is. It's a working together of people trying to blend their moral values in a way that works best for the society as a whole.
When we started the show, you were good enough to tell us about what you've taught, what you've done for a career. And so you taught at Trinity College, which clearly is a Christian-named university, that's for sure. And in its history, it has been a Christian university. These days, it's not necessarily so, correct?
It's an entirely secular institution at this point. The only sort of remnant of the Episcopal religious foundation was the chapel, which is still, while it's owned by the college, some of its funds come from religious sources.
Now, you said that you taught Christian social ethics particularly?
Correct.
So that means that as you come at these questions, you come at them from a Christian perspective.
I do.
From a Christian perspective, what are some solutions?
Well, you have to take it topic by topic. To get controversial, if you want to do that, on healthcare, it seems to me that there's a moral principle that everyone deserves healthcare regardless of their personal ability to pay for it. That means some kind of national healthcare system, or what's sometimes called a single-payer system. Some politicians are even using the phrase Medicare for all. Now, while there's a lot of debate that has to go on around the details of how that would be implemented, the provision of health care to all persons is a Christian moral principle. And I should say it's more than just a Christian moral principle. It's a Jewish, it's a Muslim, it's even a secular moral principle that many people have adopted. And so it's not Christians alone who bring something to bear on this, but they do bring their own moral religious tradition to bear on looking at these issues politically.
So could you give us an example from the Christian tradition of why it would be specifically a Christian moral issue to make sure that everybody had health care?
Well, probably the best case would be the story of the Good Samaritan. That health care that was given to the person who had been found by the roadside, said, spend all that you need to spend in order to bring this person back to health, and I will pay for it when I return. And I think it's a simple step from there to the understanding that, at least in the Christian, and I would add Judeo-Christian tradition, there's an obligation to care for those who are the most vulnerable, people who are the most disadvantaged, people who are the poorest in society. That moral obligation would require taking care not only of their medical needs, but of their educational needs, their housing needs, their nutritional needs. We are part of a Judeo-Christian tradition which looks for the good of the community as a whole, or what's sometimes called the common good. And there's no escaping that. If you want to call yourself a Christian or a Jew, you have that social moral responsibility.
Now, but you bring up, so the counter-argument to that is that then you're infringing on my personal rights.
Right, and any Christian morality infringes on your personal rights all the time. I don't have the personal right to beat my children or to abuse them. I don't have the personal right to deny them health care. I don't have the personal right to deprive them of any of those goods which we think of as essential to the well-being of humanity.
Well, so how do we address the idea then that there are people who argue very strongly that you can't infringe on my personal rights, or another so that could be taken on a micro level, that argument, but a parallel sort of macro argument is you have to always have free markets, going back to your earlier conversation.
Free markets are fine in limited contexts. I sometimes like to use the example of a market in the mowing of my lawn. I have a lawn that needs mowed. I'm no longer able to mow it myself. There's a neighbor down the street who's willing to mow it for $25 a shot. A market allows me to go to that neighbor and we can negotiate a price. And he may have some competition, so I can hopefully lower the price that I pay him, because the competition will step in if his price is too high. That's fine, but mowing my lawn is not a social necessity. It's not a social good, unless it becomes so high that it actually becomes a blight in the neighborhood. That's another topic. A market is great at that level, at the level of what we might call the provision of private goods. But when it comes to public goods, like health care, like education, like military support, like police and fire departments, those public goods are not best handled by a free market. I don't have the choice. I'm now, my children are grown, I have grandchildren, but they don't live in the town that I live in. But I am required to pay taxes in my town of residence for the education of children that are not mine. I'm obligated to do that, and that, in a sense, takes away my individual freedom to refuse to pay for their education. But I pay for their education through my taxes because it's a public good.
You know, you mentioned that as a retired person, you might be collecting Social Security, so that those who are still working are taking care of people who are retired. And so in that way, people who pay property taxes, even though they don't have students in school, are caring for young people, and people who pay into Social Security are caring for people who might be retired. And so that's a collective good where we're all playing our part, no?
Exactly. It's the collective good that we've all committed ourselves to through the political process. I mean, it is possible legally for society to decide that the elderly will no longer be given Social Security. It's possible for the society through politics to decide that Medicare is not going to be made available to people over the age of 65. So we're always in negotiation with each other in society over what will and will not, or what ought not to be provided by public funds. And public funds require taxation. So taxes are the price we pay for having a morally just society.
Well, that's an interesting way that you phrase it. Most people just put that into terms, at least what I'm familiar with, is taxes are the price you pay because you want water, you want sewer, you want roads.
Right, but I want them not just for myself personally, I want them for the society as a whole. And even outside of a Christian social ethic, there's the sense of what we might call enlightened self-interest. It's to my interest that we have decent roads. It's to my interest, even as a retired person, that we have an educated workforce, because that will help me in the long run. So taxation is absolutely necessary if I want to achieve those things which I think are good for my welfare and my well-being. And that means providing support and services to other people and not just to myself.
So collectively, we gather, we take care of each other. You use the term politics in a way that I'm very sad doesn't often get tossed around.
Right.
So a lot of people in our society will say, well, never mix religion and politics. But
Right.
You made a living out of mixing religion and politics.
Exactly, in the right way. I mean, I define politics as the work of the people. It's kind of a liturgy if you're part of that tradition.
Oh. So one's the Latin and one's the Greek, no?
Exactly.
Oh, interesting.
The word politics comes from the Greek word polis, which means community or society, or we would probably call it state. And it's necessary if we're going to live together in harmony and with a sense of justice for all, and in the sense of providing the public goods that are necessary for society to be socially healthy. And so the attack upon taxation is fundamentally misguided.
Hmm. Oh, it's so interesting. We had lunch earlier, right? And I just wanted to ask your ideas about a book I started called The Triumph of Injustice, Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zuckman. It's the subtitle is How the Rich Dodge Taxes and How to Make Them Pay.
Right.
So obviously that's what they're about in the book. But you just alluded to the idea of fair taxation. What are your ideas about fair taxation?
Well, first of all, you have to get everyone to agree that taxes are necessary. Anyone who says you can get by in creating a just society without taxation is simply being irrational and illogical. It just doesn't work. So then the question becomes, if there's to be taxation, what is the fairest and most just way of taxing people? And here there can be legitimate political argument. I think most people would argue that in some way all taxes have to be progressive. That is, the more you have, the more wealth you have, the higher the taxes that you should pay. That seems just fair. But then you start getting down into the weeds, into the specific policy recommendations, and then it becomes much more fluid and much more open as to exactly what kind of progressive tax would be the best for a society. But if you have a society in which the gap between the wealthy and the rest of society is growing larger every year, the only way to remedy that gap or to begin to close the gap is by a fair and just tax system. And we simply have to come to grips with the fact that taxation in that sense is an ancillary, necessary instrument in the establishment of social justice.
You used the term fair, and you talked about the idea that, in a progressive tax system, as you make more, you pay more.
Yes.
But others argue that's not fair.
Only in a non-communal ethic could you argue that that's not fair. I mean, there is a notion known as libertarianism, often associated with philosopher Ayn Rand. And it basically says the only moral arrangements that are just are ones between consenting adults, that I have no obligation to take care of someone else's need unless they're willing to give me something in return. It's called transactional analysis. But that is fundamentally incompatible with the communal social ethic that's found in the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's interesting to note that in the Bible, what's often talked about is not individual ethics, but corporate ethics, communal ethics, the ethics of the kingdom of God.
Mm.
And that just cannot be reconciled with an ethic which says the only thing that matters is my individual freedom. I must always be willing to sacrifice my freedom if it helps to benefit the needs of others.
So let's say this is the argument, right? I earn quite a bit of money, but I also work 12 hours a day, 6 days a week.
So do people who work in minimum wage service industries. Why is one to be rewarded at a much, much greater amount than others? It's been estimated that some CEOs in this country who at one time in American history made maybe 20 times more than the average worker in their company now make over 250 times as much as the average worker. They aren't contributing that much additional to the company for which they are serving as the CEO, and therefore their pay ought to be moderated or their taxes raised. I don't see how you can come to a different sense of fairness than that.
Well, it is interesting you bring up a statistic like that, because then the assumption would be, following this logic of I earn more because I work more, we're saying that all those years back, when the disparity wasn't so great, that CEOs were working less than they're working today? Of
Well,
course that's ridiculous, right?
Of course it's ridiculous, and what's often not taken into account is the degree to which the CEO's salary is dependent upon the public goods that they relied upon in becoming CEOs. They were educated, often in public schools. They used publicly paid for infrastructures. They use things like the internet, which are provided by public funds. They are supported by public funds in their communities through the police and fire departments. The list goes on. And if they have benefited from public goods, then they have an equal obligation to provide for the further provision of those public goods to people who are poor and disadvantaged.
But not everybody agrees with that. Have you ever given any thought to how we can get people to come around to that way of thinking on such a level that it actually has an impact?
Well, and here's probably my greatest limitation is my friends tell me I am too logical and too rational. I believe too strongly, and they would say irrationally and unrealistically, in the power of persuasion. That if you can show someone the logic of a situation, such as the provision of health care, that they'll come around to that point of view. After 77 years, I've come to the belief that maybe that's not true in all cases. So it's not going to be easy to convince people of this position, but I've got to keep trying.
Well, you bring up something interesting when you use that phrase, I gotta keep trying. I don't want to put words into your mouth, so do you mind if you just expand on that just a little bit, this idea of I gotta keep trying?
Well, I mean, I think I have an ethical compass for making the decisions that I make about my life. And even when I can't convince people of the rightness of my decision, I would be less of a full human being. I would be betraying who I essentially am to settle for easy and compromised solutions when they aren't justified by moral values. So you just have to keep trying, but with a big dose of realism. One of the greatest influences on me was Reinhold Neibuhr. And he taught us about the ambiguity of power, the necessity for uses of power, but avoiding disproportionate uses of power. And when power is being used badly, it must be met by what he called countervailing power. And that's the willingness in the end to accept something less than a perfect solution to our social problems, and just keep getting back in there every day and trying again and again.
What's its phrase or idea I'm searching for right now? Oh, well, every action there's a reaction, I guess, is kind of the idea.
Right.
So just keep acting and reacting, no?
You have to do that. I think one of the elements of the Judeo-Christian tradition that keeps me going is hope. Without hope, we won't make any advance, but just having hope is not going to guarantee an immediate solution to your moral problems. So you just have to get up every morning and try it over and over again. And there has been progress. I think we have come from a time when health care was provided completely on an individual basis. Then it was provided by companies and corporations. And then, just like Medicare and Social Security, it's become increasingly available to us through public sources as public goods. And so there has been advance. Racism has been challenged historically in this country without ever being entirely eradicated. But you have to keep trying over and over again.
That is absolutely the perfect way to end today. So I really thank you for ending on a note of hope by talking about hope. And it was great to have you on.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Everybody, this is WHUS 91.7 Stores. I'm the Reverend Brian Blair over at St. Mark's Chapel here on the campus of UConn. You've been listening to Crossroads and our wonderful guest today, Frank Kirkpatrick. Thank you very much, Frank.
Thank you, Brian.
Try to find a ride. Did you know him? I liked it.